Good morning explorers and welcome to Cattle Station, another episode for YouTube. Today we are visiting Spitalfields Charnel house. Before that we're visiting 120 Fenchurch Street, where I hope to get some spectacular views and a bite of lunch. And then this evening we're going to Hawksmoor, the famous steak restaurant. So let's dig in.
Thing down here.
Hello guys, welcome to the garden at 120.
It's quite funny with the shard kind of, the gherkin just rising out. Lazy knows what the proper name for that place is, and I can never remember it. I think I used to work up there.
You can follow us on social media, on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/bunkerbonkers, on X, x.com/bunkerbonkers, or on Threads, threads.net/@bunkerbonkers.
Have we paid for this?
Right, so as the weather is being kind to us, we'll stop outside for a few minutes, especially if your colleagues make it, they'll see the group of us. So, welcome to Priory of St Mary Spital, otherwise known as the Priory and Hospital of St Mary without Bishopsgate. So we're on the site of a late 12th century priory that was founded in 1197. The Priory Church remains under that striking building and the building next to it, and the street which is known as Spital Square, which is not a square, it is a street. And so the Priory was founded then in about 1197. Orientation, that way is north, that way is west. The main road, Bishopsgate, was one of the main Roman roads leading out of London to Essex. So that's the orientation. We're out with the Roman city walls, we're in the land beyond it, and the medieval church became very substantial landholders both within the city of London. There are about 51 religious establishments, and there were a number of much larger ones outside the Roman medieval city. So places like St Bartholomew the Great, Holy Trinity Priory, St Mary's Clerkenwell, the Knights Hospital at Clerkenwell, they're all just outside the city boundaries, and they're much bigger religious houses than the smaller ones inside. So Holywell Priory is just a little bit further up the road as well here. This was founded by well-off civilians in 1197, Walter Brown and a series of others. And it was founded as an Augustinian priory, quite small to start with, probably 6. They were canons rather than monks because of the Augustinian order, and they grew. They were a hospital, and there were very few early hospitals. I brought some of my colleagues from the office because they've not seen it before, so very good opportunity. Hospital. So the earliest hospitals in London were leper hospitals. So there was one in the area of St Giles and there was one in the area of Whitechapel. And then St Bartholomew the Great had the first hospital for the general public, and then this was either the second or the third hospital, because before then there had been religious houses, but they tended to pray and hope for the best, and this one did rather more, and the evidence from the burial ground shows that surgery was performed, We know that medicinal plants were grown on site. We know that there was a place, a building for creating medicines, and we know that there was an infirmary for the public and then an infirmary for the religious people as well. So it was quite a large establishment quite early on, and the site thrived and grew and became very well off and very substantial. And the archaeological works have excavated the remains of a number of the buildings associated with the Priory and also the burial ground, and this, which turned up in the late 1990s when this whole scheme, this area was being developed. Anyway, we will now go inside because we have the powers tonight to go through the secret door and get inside. As you can see, it's visible to the public at all times of day, but sadly it's not accessible inside unless you have special powers and can bribe the security guards with boxes of biscuits and ask them nicely to bring in special groups to have a more detailed look and a detailed tour. So I need to ask everyone to mind their heads in several places, and this will be absolutely everyone. Going through this door is the first mind your head, and then there'll be another mind your head, and I've actually just smacked my head on the other mind your head. So if I start coughing in the mouth, then you know what's happened. So please do take care, because I'm not in charge.
No, that's what I said, it needs putting together.
Usual on why we fought to save it. I'm going to stand up and I will mention at this point, this is a lovely book that the Museum of London produced, and are letting me sell at half price for £5 should anyone be interested on the way out, and tells about the history of the area, but no pressure. Right, so we've got to, we did a hospital. It had a charter to look after the sick and what is euphemistically referred to as fallen women. And we know that there were women. Oh, I should just ask, is everyone okay with me talking a lot about dead people? Sorry, I hope I said that on the email. I might have. Anyway, I will be talking about dead people quite a lot. And I should note that archaeologists work under quite serious codes of practice and ethics when it comes to working with human remains. So whilst we did do quite a lot of work on human remains on the project, it was taken with due respect, because these are people that can't say that they don't want to be dug up for the development, and that they don't want to be handled and put in cardboard boxes and measured. So we did work quite carefully around all those issues. Yes. So the hierarchy in medieval times was, as you might imagine it. So basically, the more your status on earth, the closer you were buried to the high altar, which is the godliest place, which was over there. The further away you were, the chances are that your status was perceived to be lower. And a number of ladies who sadly died in childbirth were found quite away over there. But whilst the attitudes were quite medieval, the children of any ladies that died in childbirth were looked after on the site till the age of 7. So for the medieval period, that's not bad actually. So there were upsides to the charter. So the medieval priory had the usual offices. So there were cloisters, there was the abbot's lodging, there was the gatehouse, there was the refectory, there was the dormitory, there were the range of things that you would expect. But in addition to that, you had the infirmary and you had the cemetery. And what happens with a medieval cemetery is an attrition cemetery is where people age, die, get buried, and then a bit later, a few years later, someone is buried next to them in rows. And they're buried in shrouds, generally without grave goods, and the graves are not marked. There might be something temporary, but on the whole, they're not marked. No crosses or tombstones or anything. There were 1 or 2 tombs in the burial ground, and again, we think for people of some sort of wealth and status. But generally, in an attrition cemetery, you're buried side by side. And so what happens after a couple of 100 years, people that are doing the digging forget where the earlier graves are, because there aren't necessarily plans or maps or anything marking it out. And so at that point, you need somewhere consecrated and secure to store bits that you disturb. Now this was mentioned to me a few years ago, But I hope some of you will have noticed my beautiful Halloween shirt with skull and crossbones motif on it, suitable for Halloween. But it's been suggested to me that the skull and crossbones motif originated in the medieval period, if not a bit before, because in the Christian tradition, you are required to give account of yourself on the day of judgment. So you need to be able to walk and talk, hence the skull and crossbones. This may be urban myth, but it's quite a good one. And so if you disturb a skeleton, then you are affecting their potential afterlife. And so by collecting the bits and treating them reverentially, the idea is that the bits of the body can kind of reassemble on the day of judgment. And so this is why charnel houses were introduced. So charnel houses are sometimes known as bone houses or ossuaries, particularly on the continent. They tend to go under those names rather than charnel house. But a charnel house is not a church, and it's not where you bury whole individuals. It's where you keep the bits that you've disturbed in the burial ground. And so with an attrition cemetery for a religious house that's in use and might have 100 occupants, then over a couple of hundred years, you're going to start disturbing them. And so you would expect to have a charnel house in the middle of the burial ground. This one is different. This one is very large, this one is very elaborate. This one, it was not unexpected. The archaeologist that was doing the research before the big project here predicted there would be one here, and we'll talk a bit more about that when we go down inside. But this one is surprising for a number of reasons, and this is because we predicted we would have an attrition cemetery. So Adrian, who led the excavation of the cemetery, was expecting to dig up 3,500 bodies, which at the time was going to be the largest scientifically studied cemetery assemblage anywhere in the world. And we'd got agreement from the Museum of London that they would be carefully curated. What was not anticipated was, in addition to the attrition cemetery, we would have a catastrophe cemetery, where mass grave after mass grave after mass grave after mass grave turned up. And so that meant the largest mass grave, I think, had 54 bodies in. When you have something that is causing mass graves to be dug, you don't tend to leave them open for long, probably not more than a day or 2 weeks at the most, because if something is causing catastrophe, you don't want that to get about. And so we think there was a lot of burial going on, a lot of disturbance of the earlier burials, and the need for a substantial charnel house. The reason I paused here is to give a bit of information about the architectural detail. So the lighting's not brilliant, and obviously it's quite old, so it's not as colourful as when it was first built. But there's a combination of different stone in here, and again, this is just a place for putting bits of dead bodies. Now, it was a 2-storey building, so there would have been a chapel above for masses for the dead to be said, but it wasn't a church, and that was dedicated to St Edmund the Martyr and St Mary Magdalene. But again, it's very, very elaborate. So this stone here, this chamfered plinth, firstly, it's got architectural design to it. This is oolitic limestone, so very similar to the Bath stone that you'll be familiar with, that lovely sort of rich honey colour. Then we've got cornstone, which is a lovely creamy colour. We've got Kentish ragstone, which actually is a dull grey. But we've also got Reigate stone, and some of you might be familiar with the Reigate mines.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that lovely greeny colour.
Yeah.
And so all these coins are in Reigate stone. And then we have the flint. Now I need you to mentally erase the brick, because the brick is from a later phase, but if we'd taken it away, probably the buttress would have fallen down. But the black is original. Flint is really unusual in building stone in London, but it is very decorative when it's freshly napped. So you get the crisp white of the cortex and the stark black of the... and again, big buttresses. It's a big, substantial, well-designed building, integral. We don't think the buttresses were added later to hold it up, and very beautifully designed. The steels are because we didn't know where the bottom was, and we kept digging, and when we get inside you'll understand why we kept digging and didn't quite know where the bottom was. So they're holding up. This would have been medieval ground level at this point, so you see we've come down a bit from medieval ground level. So I just want to give the impression that this is quite an unusual building when it was constructed. Its survival is extremely unusual, but its design is very unusual. So what we'll do now is we'll go around the back and go down inside. The second, really mind your heads. As I smacked mine 10 minutes ago. So please do mind your heads, but we'll go inside because it gives you a much better impression of why it's so strange. And I'll talk a bit about how it has managed to survive. We head up to the back. And again, if you want to pop your bags down, we've locked the outside door so no one can come in. And obviously take as many photos as you like.
The layer of tile, is that decorative or is it sort of damp-proof course?
It's a leveling layer. Because the stone is brought to site dressed and then it's better dressed. And when they realise they've got...
As ever, if you like the content, please give it a like. If you like the channel, please give the channel a subscribe. And if you think I'm doing a great job, please buy me a coffee using the link on screen. Thank you.
Packet, and you'll see oyster shells used as shoes.
Ah, right,
So you'll
okay.
find those
Yeah, right, thank you.
Didn't find the napping debris, to my knowledge, although it must be said that someone might have found a part of napping debris and not realised at the time what it was.
Yeah.
But I'm sure that was dressed on site because it's so tightly. Right. This is why it's so important to bring people down, give everyone an idea of the volume of the space. So, to talk more about the building, we think it dates to about 1320. We have some records of the Priory. We know, for instance, a number of people who were buried in the church, but we don't know who paid for the foundation of this. We know that it was built about 1320, which is a very interesting period. So 1197 was the foundation, so burial from then in the cemetery associated with the Priory Church. What we discovered through a programme of radiocarbon dating of the burials is that actually there was a cemetery on site here predating 1197. So it was there was burial on site, we think, for possibly 1,000 years before, and that was something that was completely unexpected. So 1320, interesting point, that predates the Black Death. This is a very large burial ground, and when we first started finding the mass graves, there was a muted excitement amongst the field team, and particularly amongst those of us that are interested in burial, because we thought it might be the Black Death. And the Black Death is really, really interesting for a whole number of reasons, and again, apologies to anyone that didn't know I was going to talk about death quite so much. But the Black Death was a real game changer in medieval life for so many reasons. It took out roughly a third to a half of the population across Europe. It changed society, it changed the dynamics quite dramatically for every reason, from money, land holdings, labour, servant-master relationships. It changed all of that. In terms of the way the disease works, it is indiscriminate. It doesn't take out preferentially the sickly or the old. It seemed to take out fit and healthy, old, young. And so as archaeologists, and again this is going to sound slightly weird, when we study human remains from burial grounds, we're studying effectively the failed population. So we're studying those that didn't make it. With the Black Death, it just takes out a third to a half of the population. And so we get a less biased view of the population. And there is a wonderful myth about London in that it's covered in plague pits. And this is something that everyone's heard, plague pits all over London. Yeah, there's one. There's one mass grave at the Royal Mint over at East Smithfield, and that's the only one that's been found. There is now a burial ground at the Charter House, but it's not a mass grave. There are several individuals that died of the Black Death that were buried in the Attrition Cemetery. And so when we started finding these mass graves, we were thinking, aha, finally. And then when we started going through the radiocarbon dating, we showed that the bulk of the mass graves predated the Black Death of 1348 to 49. This is built around 1320, and I think they're all linked. I think the reason that we have a very large, very elaborate charnel house built at this date is that they are servicing the product of digging mass grave after mass grave after mass grave. So Adrian was expecting to dig up his 3,500 medieval burials and dug up 10,516 medieval burials with some help, not entirely by himself. So we went from 3,500, which was going to be the largest scientifically excavated group anywhere, to 10,500. And that was the scale of the challenge, and that was what we were hoping. We were going to get a really good sample of the population. But in fact, the majority of them predate the Black Death. Some of them will be Black Death, you know, but it doesn't pronounce on the bone because it happens so quickly. The Black Death can't be identified from looking at the bones because it's just too quick, and doesn't give time for something to appear on the bones. And the human osteologists, and a large team of them working on the project, they looked and looked and looked, and they found a lot of interesting things. So they found that there's quite a high proportion of the population with TB. So it looks like something like 10% of the population had tuberculosis. There were lots of what's known as blunt force trauma, so people being hit, punched, swords. There was a trepanation, wasn't there? So there was surgery, and there were various healed fractures. One I particularly like, that we wrote in one of our scientific papers, is, there was a young girl that died of syphilis. And so this was congenital syphilis that was passed on, and this was a great example in the very few examples that prove that we exported syphilis to America and not the other way around, because it's always been said that the Americans gave it to us, but actually we gave it to them. So it predates Christopher Columbus is what the evidence from this site clearly demonstrated. So not necessarily something to be proud of, but scientifically it's really interesting. Anyway, so lots of work went on and on to try and find out what the catastrophe was. And that's the central line or the circle line? Circle line.
Roy?
Yes, sir.
Circle.
Circle or Elizabeth? I think Elizabeth's too deep to be circle.
It predates the Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Circle, yes. That's what the rumblings are. What is known from historical records of the time is that, I don't want to worry anybody, but this time, coming up to the sort of 1320s, was a time of increased storminess and shifts in weather pattern and increased rainfall and seasonal shift. And very much seems the end times, because what happened was crop after crop after crop after crop failed, not just here but across Europe. And what happened was surplus grain, surplus food ran out, and people could not bring in a crop, and people tried to bring in crop. And if you bring in a crop that's mildewed, there's a disease called rust or ergot that if you eat food made from it, sends you mad. So we have change in the weather patterns, we have crop failure, we have starvation beginning to stalk the land. And what I think happened, and why I think one reason we have the catastrophe cemetery, and there will be other reasons, but famine seems to have brought people here. Now that road I mentioned, the main road out of London, also one of the main roads into London. And so I think people are coming in from the countryside seeking food, work, solace, and they found a hospital. Because Holywell Priory is further up the road, and that has a fairly small cemetery with not a very large population, whereas this one has this massive population of well over 10,500 bodies. We only excavated 10,500 as part of this project. So when there is literally no food, very little food, you could be as wealthy as you like, but if there is literally nothing to buy, then people will begin to start really, really worrying. And so this is where people will put their money into charitable works and to the church, because the medieval period, again, was a time when people were generally fairly certain that there was an afterlife, and the afterlife could go one of several ways. So you could go up, you could go down, and you could go into purgatory for a very long time. But the church, of course, propagated the thought that if you did good works for the church, then you were securing a better outcome afterwards. We know that there are a number of donors to this priory. We have the names of some of them. We don't have the details of the people that built this. I mentioned on the outside, it's architecturally very elaborate. It's very large for a charnel house, which is normally a couple of bays big at the most. This is very substantial. And again, it's very decorative. We've got blocked up windows, and again, please ignore the brick because that comes from when this wall became the boundary wall of the Honourable Artillery Company. But you see that there's attempts in here at decoration, so there's coursing in the stonework. There's quite well detailed vaulting ribs, and of course we've got this central rib, which is very special indeed, and predates the Priory. So that's a Romanesque rib, which dates to maybe 1140 to 1160, and clearly predates the foundation of the Priory in 1197, and could well come from an earlier church that went with the earlier burial ground. And so this is salvaged. Clearly it doesn't date to 1320, it's been brought from elsewhere, but it had paint on when we excavated it, and it still has traces of paint. The whole thing was conserved about 5 years ago and cleaned because it was a bit dusty, but we've still got traces of the black, white and red paint on that. You can see it just about. So its survival, well, its construction I think comes from this period of famine, which we think is associated with a significant volcanic explosion in the southern hemisphere, which threw so many aerosols into the air that weather patterns shifted quite substantially. So we think that's what led to a lot of the death and burial on the site. And so as the mass graves were being dug, earlier burials were being brought up, and they needed a substantial devotional space to be housed in. What is intriguing is we don't know how the bones were laid out in here. Continental ossuaries are often very elaborate and decorative in how they're presented. That doesn't seem to have been the tradition in England. There are no fixing points that any of us have found suggesting that there was shelving or brackets or anything tied to the walls. There may have been freestanding timber shelves. The bones may simply have been piled up in skulls, pelvises, leg bones, arm bones. They may have been piled in here, we don't know. There were two small piles of human remains found in either corner, but the site had largely been cleared out because that's what it is, and that's why I think it was built so large and so elaborate. The next very intriguing thing is how it has survived so well. And the reason it survived so well is come the dissolution of the monasteries in 1538-39, the churches are all torn down because the new head of the church, Henry VIII, wanted to make sure that nobody went back to a Catholic church to worship. So the churches were torn down. The church remains do survive about that high below ground, but that's it. But other resources that could be monetised, to use the phrase, were. And has everyone seen Walpole? Any read the books? Yeah, so Cromwell and Richard Rich formed the Court of Augmentations, which was the body set up to oversee dispersal of the goods seized from the church. And that was monies, that was materials, and that was buildings. This building, as you see, a very good solid building, was able to be sold on. We don't know who it went to, but it was converted to resi. So this became a house. So we think it was largely cleared out of human remains, but not entirely. And the chapel above that was dedicated previously to St Edmund Martyr and St Mary Magdalene was converted to the house. This became the undercroft, storage and kitchen. That bay with the more brickwork and the slanting sill, that we think was knocked through to form a flue to half, and the building was converted, and that's how it survived the dissolution of the monasteries, because it could be used and raise revenue. So that's how it survived initially. We think it had started to collapse by the Great Fire of London in 1666, so about a century later, and we found a number of the vaulting rib bits and masonry inside, and we've kept some of those to show how it was formed. That wall at that point became the boundary wall of the Honourable Artillery Company that used the land on the other side for buildings and for training space. And then the last thing really that meant it survived in this form is that the City of London dumped all its waste from the Fire of London, and this was full of rubble from the Fire of London. And so by filling it very quickly, the walls were supported, and so they didn't collapse in, and the stone wasn't stolen, because you'll know that London's got no building stone of its own, so all the stone has come in from somewhere else. And then a road was cast over the top of it, and that was it till one Saturday morning. It must have been 98, Nick found it, I'd say. So yeah, the naughty archaeologist that had to do the Saturday morning watching brief with a hangover saw that wall head appear, because this was entirely buried. It wasn't known about. The archaeological director had asked for permission to carry out a trial trench evaluation in this area to look for the charnel house, and my esteemed organisation at the time said no. This is a scheduled monument, it's legally protected, you can't dig a hole in it. And it's very interesting. When I first heard about that, I thought that was a really crap decision. But now I think it was a good decision. A group of consortium of developers went to government in, I can't remember, we started the field work, well the site code's 96, the negotiations must have been a couple of years before that. So they'll have gone to government sort of 92, 93, 94, saying we want to build the London International Futures Trading Floor here. We want a big site, and if we don't get the site, we're going to go to Germany. And that's the point where Chancellor of Exchequers go. So whilst it was legally protected, scheduled monument consent was granted for the fieldwork, an enormous project, subject to full archaeological excavation, careful excavation, professionally carried out, full analysis and full publication. And I wonder if they'd known then that this survived, would they have made provision to carefully record it and then remove it? And I do wonder now, because we costed for over a year's field work, full on, with a team in the end that was about 102 strong, doing the field work. Brilliantly, very clever this, anyone writing project designs in future, we'd estimated that we would find 3,500 bodies and had costed for that project on a per body rate, which saved our backsides. So, it was a very, very expensive, very complicated project. And whilst to us, dismantling this looks very complicated, I do wonder if they'd known, but they didn't, and we didn't. And we found it, and we kept digging and kept digging and kept digging and kept digging, and it kept going on and on. And this is why we had to put the little pins outside, because we didn't know it was just going to keep going on, and it did. And this amazing thing survived. So there's very little 14th century fabric in London that isn't a church. This isn't a church, it was a charnel house with a chapel. The complete floor plan is here. It's very elaborate. You can read the architecture really clearly. The reason that you all had to bend down is because we have the medieval threshold, and we've got the base of the stone staircase. So you can see how it works. The staircase that went up is over there. You can see the buttresses. You can see these windows, which would have been to let light and ventilation in. You can read the vaulting ribs. You can read the coursing of the stonework. You can read so much of the architectural detail. And so at the time the fieldwork started, I was working for the Museum of London with Adrian and was on the environmental team and the bodies team. But then by the time the decisions had come to be made about what to do with this, I'd gone over to work for then English Heritage as science advisor, and a group of us went to the developer to try and put the case for retention. It's incredibly difficult to go to a developer when the site is live. So it wasn't just the archaeologists happily pottering away. Plant was moving and construction was going. And it's so expensive to redesign a scheme at that time, practically no one will. And we went to them and said, there's this really lovely building in the middle of your building site. How do you feel about
Yeah, well, I mean, as we know, it's all come in.
When we take people down,
Old fashioned.